Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Purpose and Valor Podcast. My name is Marcus, and this podcast is about clarity, leadership, responsibility, and learning how to move forward, especially when life feels heavy or uncertain. This podcast is for people who feel stuck, overwhelmed, or unsure about their next step, but still want to grow, lead, and live with intention. Hey everybody, and welcome back to episode 4 of the Purpose and Valor Podcast. Today I want to talk about something that a lot of people deal with every single day, but don't always fully understand, and that's the feeling of being overwhelmed. Not just being busy, but feeling mentally overloaded. That feeling where there's just too much going on at once, too many responsibilities, too many things to think about, too many decisions to make, and really no clear way to slow it all down. And if you ever felt like that, like your mind just doesn't shut off, I know mine does sometimes, then this should hit. This should hit home. Overwhelm isn't just about having a lot to do. It's when everything starts to stack up mentally and you don't necessarily know where to start, so everything feels equally important, right? And when everything feels important, nothing feels clear. And that's where overwhelm, really comes from. You can be busy without being overwhelmed, right? And you can be overwhelmed without actually being productive. So let me explain that a little better. You have a full day, you get a lot done, and can still feel in control. That's being busy. But overwhelm is different. Overwhelm is when you're doing things, but your mind is still racing a million miles an hour. You're thinking about what's next, what you forgot, what you still need to do. Did I do this? Did I do that? You're just going back and forth and around in circles, and it never really slows down. And over time, that starts to wear you down mentally. It affects your focus, your patience, your energy, and even how you show up for the people around you. There have been times where I've felt exactly like that. I can count on both hands, both feet, and everybody else is around me, how many times I felt like that. Where I had a lot going on, responsibilities, things that needed to be done. And I was handling them all. I was getting them done, but mentally, I was shot. I felt overloaded. Like, no matter what I got done, there was always more sitting in the back of my mind. And that's the part that gets exhausting. It's not always the work itself. It's the mental weight of everything you're carrying. You start to feel like you can't shut it off. And when you're trying to relax, your mind is just still running a million miles an hour. Most people don't just choose to stay overwhelmed and just choose to stay in that mentality because they want to. They stay overwhelmed because they never just take that step back long enough to reset. They're constantly moving from one thing to the next, taking care of the responsibilities that they need to take care of, taking care of the people in their lives, going to work, trying to keep up, but never actually slowing down enough to think clearly. And when you can't slow down, and when you don't slow down, you don't organize your thoughts. And when your thoughts aren't organized, everything feels chaotic. We've all been there. If you're constantly reacting constantly jumping from one thing to the next, you're never going to give yourself a chance to take that step back and ask, what actually matters right now? Everything just keeps piling up, and a lot of people avoid slowing down because they feel like they don't have time. And that's what it, comes down to. People just feel like there's not enough time in the day. So they got to tackle everything at once rather than just stopping, slowing down, and focusing on what needs to get done now, what matters now. Or they feel like if they stop, things will fall behind, and then the next day is going to be even more chaotic. But in reality, not slowing down is what keeps us stuck. Not slowing down is what keeps us from being able to move forward with clarity. A lot of overwhelm comes from our responsibilities, the things we have to take care of, and especially the people that depend on us, right? Whether that's your family, your job, people who rely on you to show up consistently, coworkers, friends, whatever the case may be, and that pressure builds because it's not about you anymore. And when you're carrying that kind of responsibility, you don't always feel like you just have the option to slow down. You just keep going. You handle what's in front of you. You push through, but mentally, it stacks up. And you're overloaded. And you've hit mental exhaustion. Responsibility by itself isn't a bad thing, right? But responsibility without direction becomes overwhelming. Because now you're trying to manage everything without that clear structure. I want you to think about a time where you had a lot of responsibility on your shoulders, your family, your friends, your work, and how'd you handle it? Were you prepared mentally? Did it feel heavy? Didn't feel heavy because you couldn't do it, but because there was just so much to keep track of. And then that's where it starts to build. Not from weakness, but from just carrying too much without clarity and direction. Most people respond to overwhelm by trying to do more, trying to stay ahead, trying to get ahead of it. They try to push harder. They try to handle everything faster. But that usually just makes it worse. That's where you start making mistakes. Because now you're adding more to something that's already overloaded. And, if your mind is already full, adding more tasks, more pressure, more urgency doesn't create control. It creates more stress. And a lot of people think if I just get more done, I'll feel better. But what usually happens is they get more done and they still feel overwhelmed. Because the problem isn't how much you're doing. Again, the problem isn't how much you're doing. It's how much you're carrying mentally without structure, without clarity. You don't fix this by doing more, okay? You got to take control. You simply fix it by taking a step back, getting clear on what actually matters right now. I keep saying this. Getting clear on what actually matters right now. Not everything, right now. You don't need to solve your entire situation. You don't need to go out and solve the world's problems. You don't need to have everything figured out. And most of the time, what you really need is your clear next step. One thing to focus on. because clarity creates control, and control reduces that overwhelming feeling. And when you know what matters the most in that moment and what doesn't, everything starts to feel more manageable. And that's where things start to shift. Not all at once, but step by step. If you're feeling overwhelmed right now, I guarantee the person next to you is feeling overwhelmed. The person next to them is feeling overwhelmed. There's a lot going on in the world today, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed. Okay? You're carrying a lot, but you don't have to carry it all at once. Start by stepping back, getting clear, and focusing on what actually matters right now. That's where the control starts. Thank you for listening to another episode of Purpose and Valor Podcast. Always remember, stay focused, stay strong, and keep moving forward.